This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. This event was the closest the world has ever come to an all-out nuclear war. In 1959, Cuba's Revolutionary War resulted in the first communist dictatorship in the Western Hemisphere. The United States had been previously concerned about the spread of communism, so when we heard we had a new Marxist neighbor 90 miles south of Florida, we weren't exactly thrilled. To make matters worse, Cuba was backed by the Soviet Union, our greatest enemy at the time. That same year, the United States made a deal with Turkey's leaders to place nuclear missiles in Turkey to deter the Soviet Union from invading Turkey. Fast forward to 1961. President John F. Kennedy launched the Bay of Pigs invasion with CIA-trained Cuban exiles to retake Cuba from communist Fidel Castro. The invasion was a massive failure, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw President Kennedy as too weak. Castro felt threatened by this invasion, and as a result he requested protection from the Soviets. Khrushchev decided he wanted to have an advantage against the US by building nuclear launch sites in Cuba. The short-range missiles that were set up could reach as far as Washington, D.C., while the intermediate missiles could reach most of the US. On October 14, 1962, the United States used high-flying U-2 spy planes to discover Soviet-supplied nuclear launch sites placed in Cuba, and we moved to DEFCON 3. The U.S. Joint Chiefs told JFK that this was a good chance to liberate Cuba, but he disagreed and feared that attacking could provoke nuclear disaster. Instead, JFK tried contacting Castro demanding that the missiles be removed. After the initial request was ignored, the president had two options: launch a full-scale attack on Cuba or forcefully demand again for the missiles to be removed. JFK decided to take the middle route. Instead of trying to take over Cuba, he decided that American ships would set up a naval quarantine so Soviet ships could not bring more missiles into Cuba. They called this a quarantine instead of a blockade because technically a blockade is an act of war, and war was the one thing we were trying to avoid. Khrushchev became furious. He claimed the United States was risking war and that we had no right to be blocking their ships. When we got this message the night of October 23rd, defense went up to DEFCON 2. The highest nuclear defense alert in history. This meant the US was just one step from launching nuclear weapons. JFK still had the option of invading, but he decided to hold out for diplomacy. Neither side was backing down. The situation became a stalemate. Word reached the president from a Soviet spy claiming they would retrieve the missiles from Cuba if the US pledged to leave Cuba alone. A day later, President Kennedy received what appeared to be a personal letter from Khrushchev asking to meet and discuss to stop tightening the knot of war. It is unknown whether or not this letter was authentic. Meanwhile, Fidel Castro felt an American invasion was imminent and requested that the Soviets should attack before the US did. On October 27th, or later known as Black Saturday, Khrushchev made a new deal for Kennedy, demanding that the missiles in Turkey be removed. It turned out that the missiles in Turkey were obsolete and the US had planned to remove them anyway. The same day, a Soviet submarine got a little too close to the US quarantine and one of the warships dropped warning depth charges. The sub was armed with nuclear weaponry and had permission to fire, but thanks to the sub's captain Vasily Arkhipov, no torpedoes were fired. If Arkhipov had decided to retaliate, it was very likely that World War III would have followed. Finally, that evening, the two countries came to an agreement. They would remove all of the missiles in Cuba, Italy, and Turkey, and the United States pledged to leave Cuba alone. After the weapons were dismantled and shipped out of Cuba, the US dropped their quarantine. The Soviet Union was seen as weak because of this event, and as a result, Khrushchev lost power 2 years later. President Kennedy was assassinated just over a year after the crisis. The situation as a whole was a result of poor communication. So America and the Soviet Union set up a Washington-Moscow hotline to allow their leaders to communicate directly between themselves in the case of a future crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended up being the closest we've ever been to mutual nuclear destruction.